The city of Mzuri was a place where power thrived in the hands of the wealthy. Its streets were paved with ambition, and its nights were filled with indulgence-lavish parties, whispered scandals, and secrets buried under gold and luxury. And at the center of it all was Nadira. She was not just another beautiful woman. She was an enigma, an untouchable force that men desired beyond reason. She walked into elite gatherings like a ghost wrapped in silk, her presence a whispered temptation in the minds of those who saw her. They said she had no past, no family, no history that anyone could trace. Yet, every man who dined at her table was never the same. Whispers followed her like a shadow. Did you hear about Chaik? He lost everything after meeting her. Jabari signed over his estate, left his wife and kids for her. Now he sleeps in the streets. She is a curse. A demon, but no one could prove anything. And that was because no man who had fallen into Nadira's web could speak of what happened behind her doors. They belonged to her body and soul. And once she was done with them, they ceased to exist. Deep within the walls of her home, Nadira prepared her greatest weapon. Her kitchen was not just a place for cooking. It was an altar, a place of magic, of rituals, of power woven through food. Tonight, she stood over a large cast iron pot, its surface bubbling with a golden broth, thick, rich, fragrant. The kind of meal that could make a man feel like he had stepped into paradise. She moved with slow, deliberate precision. From a small silver bowl, she lifted a glistening liquid, her own essence. It was a secret she had learned long ago, from a woman whose name had been lost to time. Your body is the key, Nadira, the woman had whispered. When they consume a part of you, they are yours forever. At first, Nadira had been repulsed by the idea, but she had seen the results. The first man she had tested it on, a merchant named Rashid, had gone mad for her. Within days, he had abandoned his family. Within weeks, he had given her everything he owned. And when he was finally drained of all his worth, she had completed the curse. She turned to a hidden cabinet, unsealing a clay jar. A foul, putrid smell filled the air. Inside lay the final ingredient: her waste. Her teacher had told her that the first meal enslaved them, but the last meal, the one mixed with her filthest, destroyed them. Some died within days, their bodies shutting down. Others lived, but they lost everything: wealth, strength, sanity. She stirred the broth, a cruel smile touching her lips. Tonight, she would serve the first meal, and soon her next victim would belong to her. But Nadira had not always been this way. Once, she had been a girl with hope. Born into a modest family, she had once believed in love, in kindness, in promises. She had loved a man named Rashid, a wealthy merchant who had promised her the world. He had told her he would marry her, whispered sweet lies into her ears as they lay beneath the stars. She had given herself to him, believing she was his forever. But promises are fragile things in the hands of the rich. Days before their wedding, Rashid married another, a woman of higher status, chosen by his family. Nadira had begged, had pleaded with him. "You said you loved me," she whispered. He only laughed. "You are beautiful, Nadira, but love does not put gold in a man's hands." He left her that night, and days later, her unborn child died inside her. Something inside her snapped. She wandered for days, consumed by grief, until she found herself at the edge of the city where people feared to go. And there, In a small hut surrounded by bones and whispers, she found her salvation. An old woman sat before her, eyes dark as the night. "I have nothing left," Nadira whispered. "Give me power, so I will never be powerless again." The woman studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Very well," she said, "but power comes at a price." And so Nadira gave up her soul. She was no longer a girl. She became a force, a hunger, and she would never be weak again. Jabari was a businessman who had everything: a mansion, a loving wife, children who adored him. Yet, in Nadira's presence, all of that meant nothing. She met him at a high society gala, dressed in crimson silk. Her smile was a trap. "You must join me for dinner," she whispered, fingers grazing his wrist. That night, Jabari sat at her candlelit table, marveling at the richness of her meal. He took the first bite, and the moment the food touched his tongue, his fate was sealed. Days passed, and Jabari was not the same. His wife noticed first the way his eyes seemed distant, the way he spent nights away, the way he no longer cared about their home. He was drowning in obsession. Within a month, he signed over everything he owned to Nadira. His wife and children begged, but he could not hear them. And then the final meal came. One evening, Nadira prepared him his last supper, the one laced with her filth. He ate, unaware of the darkness slipping into his soul. Days later, Jabari collapsed in the streets. His wealth was gone. His power vanished. His mind shattered. And when people walked past him, they whispered, "Did you hear about Jabari? He was one of the richest men in Mzuri. Now, he doesn't even remember his own name." He was the first, but he would not be the last. Jabari wandered the streets of Mzuri, his mind a prison of echoes. He no longer knew who he was, only that something was missing, something he could never get back. He saw faces, familiar and strange, but their voices were just shadows in the wind. "Papa," a small voice called. He turned his head slowly. A little girl stood before him, her dark eyes filled with tears. Behind her, a woman, tall, elegant, but broken. His wife? His daughter? "Papa, let's go home," the girl whispered, reaching for his hand. Jabari blinked, as if waking from a dream. Home. A word that once meant something. He hesitated. Something deep within him yearned to follow them. But then, a voice slithered through his thoughts. "You belong to me, Jabari. You always will." Nadira's voice. His body went rigid. The warmth of his daughter's hand faded. A cold, hollow emptiness swallowed him whole. And just like that, he turned away. His wife let out a silent sob. She had lost him forever. From the window of her small home, Mama Asha watched. She had seen it before. Men who once ruled the city, now nothing but ghosts. Her own husband had fallen victim years ago. A good man, a kind man, until he wasn't. One night, he had returned home a stranger. His eyes were empty, his touch cold. Within months, he was dead. Mama Asha had spent years asking why, until she learned the truth. She had heard the whispers of Nadira, the woman who never aged, the woman who took everything and left behind only ruin. Mama Asha clenched her fists. She had stayed silent for too long, but no more. She needed to find someone who could stop Nadira before another man was lost. deep in the outskirts of Mzuri. Among the forgotten alleys, there was a man known as Baba Nyoka, a priest, a mystic, a man who walked the line between light and darkness. Mama Asha stood before him, her voice strong but desperate. "I need your help," she said. Baba Nyoka studied her. His eyes, old and wise, already knew. "You seek to break the spell of the woman who feeds on men," he murmured. Mama Asha nodded. The priest sighed, running his fingers over a worn, ancient book. "Nadira is not merely a woman," he said. "She is something beyond human now. Her power is woven into the fabric of her being." He flipped through the book's pages. "There's one way to stop her, but it must be done before she serves the final meal to her next victim. If we wait too long, the curse will be sealed forever." Mama Asher's hands tightened into fists. They had to act now. Nadira stood before a grand mirror, adjusting her golden earrings. She had chosen her next victim carefully. Kwame, a powerful politician, respected, wealthy, untouchable. Or so he thought. She had seen the hunger in his eyes when they met at the gala, the way he had looked at her like she was something rare, something forbidden. That was all she needed. She arrived at a luxurious dinner where he was the guest of honor. Draped in red silk, she moved through the crowd like a whispered promise. When Kwame saw her, his breath caught. She smiled at him, tilting her head slightly. "I have heard great things about you, Mr. Kwame." He swallowed hard. "And I have heard nothing about you." Her lips curved. "That is because men prefer to keep me a secret." She leaned closer, her perfume filling his senses. "Would you like to know why?" Kwame forgot the world around him. By the end of the night, he was following her home. The trap had been set. Nadira led Kwame into her home, pouring him a glass of rich, spiced wine. She watched as he sipped, his body relaxing under her influence. "Tell me, Kwame," she whispered, running a finger down his arm. "What is it that a man like you desires most?" Kwame exhaled slowly. His thoughts swam in honey. I want." He never finished his sentence. A sudden, sharp knock echoed through the room. Nadira's eyes darkened. No one ever interrupted her. She walked to the door and opened it. Baba Nyoka and Mama Asha stood before her. The priest's voice was calm, but his eyes burned with power. "Your time has come, Nadira." For the first time in years, Nadira felt fear. She knew who he was. She knew what he had come to do. But she would not be defeated so easily. "You dared challenge me," she hissed. Baba Nyoka raised his hand, holding a sacred talisman. The air shifted. The room shook. Kwame, still seated at the table, gasped. His mind caught in a battle between freedom and enslavement. The spirits of Nadira's past victims began to stir. Their whispers grew louder. Nadira's power was unraveling. She let out a scream of rage. But it was too late. The walls of her home trembled as the dark forces she had called upon for years turned against her. Shadows stretched, faces emerged from the darkness. Men she had destroyed. Men she had cursed. They reached for her, their voices a storm of agony. She could not escape them. Her beauty began to wither. Her skin cracked. Her once lush hair fell in strands. She screamed, "No, I was meant to rule. I was meant to." Her voice was swallowed by the abyss. And then she was gone. Kwame collapsed, gasping as the spell broke. The hunger, the obsession, the madness, it all vanished in an instant. Across Mzuri, the men Nadira had cursed began to heal. Some regained their wealth. Some would never be the same. But they were free. Mama Asha closed her eyes. It was over. Word of Nadira's downfall spread quickly. Her house stood abandoned, untouched. No one dared enter. The city whispered her name in fear. She is gone, they said, but in the distant hills, under the cover of night. A new woman walked into a wealthy district. She was beautiful, enchanting, dangerous. And in the wind, a voice whispered, "The feast is never truly over. The end, or a new beginning." So, was this truly the end? Or just the beginning of something even darker? What do you think happens next? Drop your theories in the comments.